Congo, 1964. The world called it a rebellion, but for the men who entered that jungle, it was something closer to a war of shadows. The Simba uprising spread like fire through the heart of Africa, carried by Soviet whispers and the promise of red flags rising over Stanleyville. Washington could not intervene openly. The Cold War demanded silence as much as force. And the order was simple: send the Green Berets, but never admit they were there. The mission was not glory, but disappearance. Officially, they were advisors, training Belgian mercenaries to hold the line. Unofficially, they became hunters in a place that seemed to devour hunters whole. Each night, reconnaissance patrols pushed deeper, boots sinking into swamps, rifles raised against guerrillas who might never appear. Yet unease spread before the first contact was ever made. Radios faltered without cause. Local guides refused to cross certain rivers, whispering of places where men vanished without a trace. To outsiders, it sounded like superstition. Still, there was something in the air, heavy, watchful, as if the jungle itself had been waiting long before politics brought soldiers to its edge. And in time, they would learn that not every enemy carried a rifle, and not every battle could be explained by the Cold War. Captain Hale led the patrol through the swamp, but even his silence betrayed the strain. The Congo did not greet men with bullets, but with a heat that felt like a permanent ambush. The air pressed down like lead, clinging to skin, soaking through uniforms until they became a second layer of torment. Sergeant Grant muttered curses under his breath as the mud swallowed his boots, each step a battle to remain upright. Private Torres wiped sweat from his eyes, the salt blurring his sight, while clouds of mosquitoes pierced through fatigues like needles. Even the weapons suffered. Moisture crept into bolts and magazines, refusing to let steel stay dry. Breathing itself became combat, a constant effort to hold formation in a place that seemed intent on bending every man to its will. The jungle watched. Towering trees rose like the columns of a cathedral without gods, sealing the sky with a canopy of shadowed green. Sergeant First Class Price halted often, listening, his instincts sharpened in other wars, yet unsettled here. Every crack of a branch carried the weight of an ambush. Every insect's whine whispered like the approach of incoming rounds. For soldiers trained to find an enemy through their sights, it was unnerving to face one without a face. The forest did not simply surround. It pressed inward, filled lungs, crawled into thought, corroded discipline with the creeping suspicion that rifles meant nothing here. Survival depended not on tactics, but on endurance. And endurance was already fraying at the edges. The patrol advanced in disciplined formation, but the silence between men grew heavier than the jungle itself. Captain Hale checked his map under the dim red glow of a flashlight, while Sergeant Grant kept his rifle sweeping across the tree line. The guides, two Congolese hunters contracted to lead the way, slowed their pace until they nearly stopped. Their eyes searched the ground, not for tracks of rebels, but for something else, something unseen. Private Torres noticed their hands trembling as they whispered in Lingala, refusing to step into certain stretches of forest. When pressed, they shook their heads, muttering a single word: forbidden. Sergeant First Class Price moved closer to them, his voice low but firm, demanding clarity. The guides would not look him in the eye. They pointed toward a stand of trees ahead and crossed themselves, a gesture Price had never seen from men who claimed no church. The refusal spread unease through the squad. If men who knew the terrain better than anyone feared to tread further, then what did they sense? Orders demanded progress, but instinct whispered restraint. The jungle was not just resisting passage, it was warning them. And warnings, in war, were rarely ignored, without consequence. At night, when the patrol rested near small fires that barely held back the dark, stories began to surface. The interpreters, speaking in hushed tones, shared tales carried by hunters and villagers. Men who stepped too far into the wrong valleys and never returned. Rivers where even the crocodiles refused to linger. Places where the birds never sang. Captain Hale dismissed it as fear dressed in folklore. But Private Torres listened closely, his eyes lingering on the tree line as if waiting for it to move. Sergeant Grant laughed once, short and sharp, but even he stopped smiling when the jungle answered his echo with silence. The guides never told these stories during the march. Only when the night pressed down, when the jungle seemed to lean closer, did they whisper of shadows older than the war itself. They spoke of clearings where webs thicker than rope hung from the trees, of paths that twisted back on themselves, as if leading men in circles toward their own disappearance. Sergeant First Class Price wrote a single line in his journal. "They fear what the forest hides, and I fear they may be right." In the stillness that followed, the men realized something more unsettling than enemy fire. The jungle did not need rebels to fight them. It had rules of its own and punishments for those who broke them. The first signs came quietly, almost too subtle to notice. Captain Hale tried to raise headquarters on the radio, but all he caught was static, a low hiss that clawed at the ears like distant thunder. Sergeant Grant adjusted the frequencies, his hands steady from years of field work, yet the signal only grew worse. Sometimes voices bled through, words fragmented, syllables out of order, as if two conversations overlapped but belonged to no language they knew. Private Torres tapped the handset with nervous insistence, convinced it was just the humidity clogging the circuits. But Sergeant First Class Price shook his head. He had seen radios die before, but never speak in broken tongues. Lanterns became the next casualty. Batteries were fresh, checked twice before the mission, yet the beams flickered and dimmed at random. The darkness seemed to press harder each time the light faltered, as though the jungle itself inhaled and exhaled around them. Torres swore he saw movement in those moments, shapes shifting just beyond reach of the glow. But when the light steadied, there was nothing. Hale kept the men moving, refusing to give superstition room to grow. But in his own chest he felt the weight of unease. Steel and discipline were meant to be unshakable, but even steel corrodes under pressure it cannot name. Later, in the safety of a dim base camp, the equipment was checked again. Radios were opened, wires inspected, batteries tested. Nothing was wrong. The circuits were intact, the power steady. Yet the reports carried back to headquarters contained only a bland phrase, temporary interference. To the men, however, it was not interference. It was intrusion. Something unseen had reached into their tools and bent them, not to break, but to remind them of control. And in war, when your weapons and instruments no longer obey, the first defeat is already written. The malfunctioning radios and failing lights might have been dismissed as technical flaws, but what followed could not. That night, as the men crouched near their flickering lanterns, a new disturbance began. It was sound, not random, not natural, but a rhythm. Sharp cracks echoed just beyond the perimeter, evenly spaced, circling the patrol as if unseen footsteps marked the ground. Captain Hale raised his fist, and silence gripped the squad. The noise repeated, deliberate, patient, as if someone, or something, walked in cadence around them. Sergeant Grant muttered that it had to be rebels, yet his tone betrayed doubt. Private Torres counted each interval, realizing the rhythm matched marching feet, though slower, heavier, dragging. Sergeant First Class Price listened longer, certain the sound shifted position, not closing in, not fading away, but orbiting them, studying them. Each repetition carved deeper into their nerves, until even the jungle seemed to listen, the insects pausing, the birds refusing to answer. The silence between the cracks weighed heavier than the sound itself, a hollow presence pressing in from all sides. When dawn broke, they searched the soil for prints. The mud should have preserved every step, but the ground was unmarked, untouched. No boots, no bare feet, no broken brush. Hale recorded only one line in his notes. The forest marches, but not as men do. The squad tried to move on, but their eyes drifted upward now, toward the canopy above. If something had circled them without leaving a trace, perhaps it had never touched the earth at all. Eyes that once scanned the mud now lifted toward the canopy. The forest roof loomed like a second sky, dense and tangled, almost impenetrable. Private Torres was the first to freeze, his hand rising slowly to point upward. Something had moved above the trees, massive enough to shift branches without breaking them, as if the jungle itself breathed overhead. Captain Hale ordered silence again, and every man tilted his head back, searching the darkness between the leaves. For a long moment nothing stirred, and they might have doubted Torres, until a branch bent under a weight too heavy for wind. Sergeant Grant cursed under his breath, rifle trained upward, though his sight caught nothing but shifting shadows. Sergeant First Class Price steadied his breathing, trying to separate illusion from reality. The movement was deliberate, not the sway of vines, not the scatter of monkeys. It lingered just long enough for the men to know they had been seen. The canopy became a ceiling of suspicion, each rustle a threat, each gap between leaves an unseen eye. Hale signaled to keep formation, but the discipline felt brittle, like glass held too tight. Above them, something vast kept pace, neither hurrying nor hiding. When they finally broke into a clearing, the sensation followed. The men scanned the treetops, half expecting to see a figure crouched among the branches. Nothing revealed itself, but the impression remained, a presence tracking them from above, silent and patient. In his journal, Price would later write, "It does not walk the ground. It waits where the sky turns green." No report mentioned it, no debrief dared to ask. Yet from that day forward, the squad moved with a new habit, glancing upward as often as forward, as if war no longer surrounded them, but hovered overhead. The jungle narrowed, until the patrol found itself funneled into a passage where the trees leaned unnaturally close. Captain Hale motioned for silence as Private Torres raised his hand, pointing at strands stretched across the path. At first, they seemed like vines, pale in the dim light, but Sergeant Grant reached out and stopped short. The threads were thicker than cord, smooth and taut, catching the glow of the lantern like glass. He tugged one with his bayonet. It did not snap, but vibrated, humming faintly as though alive. No vine grew that way. The men stared, unwilling to move forward, as if the forest itself had drawn a line. Sergeant First Class Price ordered the guide to approach, but the man shook his head violently, muttering a prayer in a tongue the soldiers could not follow. Hale clenched his jaw. Orders pressed them forward, yet every instinct screamed to retreat. Torres tested the strands again, finding them stretched not just across the path, but woven high between the trees. It was not random growth. It was architecture. The jungle, already hostile, now revealed a new face, one that did not belong to nature as they understood it. The squad exchanged glances, men of war suddenly children before something older than battle. When they forced their way through, cutting carefully, the threads clung to steel like flesh. The bayonets tore, but not easily, and the fibers resisted with a strength no plant possessed. Price noted how the strands recoiled, curling back as though retreating. Even as they advanced, each man carried the sense that they were intruding on a space not meant for them. Hale's orders held them steady, but his own steps slowed, the weight of command measured against an unseen dread. What kind of hand, he wondered silently, could weave fibers strong enough to bind the jungle? And what lived at the center of such design? Breaking through, they emerged into an opening. The clearing was unnatural, a circle carved into the heart of the forest, where the webbing thickened and converged. At first, they thought it chaos, a tangle of fibers draped across branches. But as the lantern steadied, the shape revealed itself. Not random, but deliberate, strands arranged with purpose. Grant muttered under his breath, unable to name what he saw. The clearing was not just passage, it was a threshold. And upon its ground, the men would soon see patterns that no man could mistake for accident. What seemed at first to be tangled debris revealed itself under closer light. The strands on the ground were not scattered but arranged, circles within circles, spirals that tightened toward a center no man dared step upon. Private Torres whispered that it looked like a nest, but Sergeant Grant shook his head. It was too precise, too deliberate, as though drawn with instruments, not hands. Captain Hale crouched, tracing the edge of one circle with the barrel of his rifle, unwilling to touch it directly. The fibers were white, nearly luminous, and lay upon the earth with the weight of stone. Patterns in war could mean codes, traps, messages. But here, none of them could read what was written. Sergeant First Class Price studied the formation, journal in hand. He had seen battlefields marked with mines, trenches carved into symbols for aerial maps, but never this. The geometry was flawless, repeating with symmetry that mocked chance. Every strand met another at deliberate angles, like architecture reduced to threads. Grant muttered that nothing in the forest grew this way, and the guide spat on the ground, refusing to even look. The men shifted uneasily, trapped between curiosity and fear. If this was creation, it belonged to no craftsman they recognized. If it was warning, it was written in a language older than memory. The squad circled the clearing, trying to find a break, a flaw in the pattern that might explain its maker. But the design held, perfect and unyielding. Torres swore he felt heat rising from the ground, though no flame burned, as if the earth itself pulsed beneath the web. Hale ordered the men to hold formation, but his voice wavered, the certainty of command bending under the weight of the inexplicable. War taught men to adapt, to rationalize, to explain the unexplainable. But here, explanation dissolved. Price wrote a single line: "This is not meant for us to walk upon." As the lanterns flickered, the symmetry cast shadows that seemed to move independently. The patterns shifted with the light, spirals appearing to tighten, circles expanding as if alive. Torres dropped his canteen when a fiber twitched near his boot, recoiling like muscle. The squad froze, rifles ready, but nothing struck. Only the sense that they were no longer observers, but participants in something waiting to begin. Then the jungle itself hushed, a silence too deep, too sudden. And in that void, every man understood. The pattern was not decoration. It was preparation. The silence fell without warning, and it was heavier than gunfire. One moment, the jungle throbbed with its endless chorus of insects and distant birds. The next, it collapsed into stillness, so complete it seemed unnatural. Rifles lifted higher, eyes darted across the tree line, but the forest gave no answer. The men strained to catch even the faintest buzz of wings, yet nothing stirred. Captain Hale held his breath, realizing that silence was not absence, but attention. Something was listening, and it was close. The guides were the first to break. They sank to their knees, pressing foreheads to the soil, whispering prayers in voices cracked with terror. Hardened by war, these men now shook like children, muttering in broken French, "The hunter has chosen." Hale ordered them to rise, but they would not move, as if their bodies already belonged to the forest. The squad exchanged uneasy glances, discipline fraying under a fear that had no enemy to face. The silence was no longer passive. It was verdict. Then came the shift, a vibration low through the ground, subtle but undeniable. The tremor crept upward through their boots, as if something vast stirred beneath the clearing. Fingers tightened on triggers, throats swallowed dry, yet no one dared speak. The pattern on the ground seemed to quiver, almost alive. Lantern beams flickered, bending strangely, caught in invisible currents. The path behind them felt sealed, as though retreat itself had been forbidden. In a notebook, words scrawled hastily captured the moment. It waits, and the forest waits with it. And in that instant, they understood. They were not intruders. They were prey. No shot was fired, no cry was raised, yet every man knew that stepping into the clearing had carried them beyond war and into judgment. The silence pressed against their lungs, against their thoughts, a presence vast and unseen. Even after they stumbled forward, breaking free from the circle of patterns, the weight followed like shadow. Slowly, the jungle's voice returned. Insects in hesitant buzzes, birds in nervous bursts. The weight of unseen eyes clung to every man, their boots rooted to the soil marked by patterns they could not read. Then it happened. From the black fringe of the clearing, a violent rustle tore through the stillness. And in an instant, Private Torres was gone. One moment his rifle glinted under the lantern's glow. The next he was pulled backward, swallowed by shadow. His scream cut sharp, human, desperate, then ended with a snap, as if crushed by the dark. The squad pivoted in shock, rifles snapping upward, lantern beams slicing across the trees. Hale barked for order, but the command wavered against the raw fear gripping the men. Grant's breath came ragged, eyes locked on the place where Torres had stood. There was nothing. No body, no struggle, not even a broken branch. Only the echo of absence, heavier than any shot. It was not ambush, not enemy fire. Something had taken him, and the silence that followed was worse than the scream. From the clearing's edge came movement again, heavy, deliberate, shifting the air itself. Price swung his light, catching a blur too fast to follow. Mass withdrawing deeper into the canopy's shadow. The forest seemed to recoil with it, branches bending as if under weight. The men opened fire, bursts carving flashes into the dark. For an instant, muzzle light revealed shapes vast and crooked, legs thick as trunks, shadows bending where they should not. Then all was still, broken only by the sound of brass hitting soil. The squad drew tighter, breath shallow, fingers restless on triggers. Hale ordered a perimeter, but discipline felt thin, brittle as glass. Torres was gone, erased without proof of death. The guides whispered prayers with eyes fixed on the trees, refusing to meet the soldiers' gaze. In that moment, even Hale understood the truth he had resisted. They were not chasing rebels in the Congo. They had stepped into something else entirely, and whatever owned this place had just claimed its first man. The flashes from the rifles had revealed just enough to plant terror in every man. Not shadows of rebels, not fleeting shapes of enemies fleeing fire, but something vast, wrong, moving with unnatural speed. Captain Hale steadied his breathing, though his pulse thundered in his ears. He raised a fist, signaling the men to hold fire, but the jungle answered with nothing. Then, from the treetops, a glint caught the lantern beam. Eyes. Not one pair, but many, reflecting back in unnatural symmetry. They blinked all at once, then froze, unblinking, watching. Sergeant Grant's voice cracked in a whisper. "God help us." His rifle trembled as he tried to aim, but the scale of what loomed before them defied training. The creature circled them, silent but heavy, each step sending tremors through the soil. Torres's scream still rang in their minds, now given shape in the glint of jaws hidden in the dark. Hale barked orders, demanding discipline, but his voice carried no anchor. War prepared men to face what they could measure, target, and destroy. But this thing could not be measured. Its form stretched too high, its movements too fluid, its intent unreadable. The men gripped their weapons tighter, but already they knew their rifles were no more than sparks against a storm. Then the grenade went off, white phosphorus bursting the clearing into cruel light. For a second, the horror revealed itself, a body armored in shadow, eyes scattered like constellations, mandibles shining with predatory hunger. The men recoiled, some firing, some shouting. But it was the guide's voice that cut deepest. He screamed a name in Lingala, then repeated in broken French, trembling, Fofi, the giant spider. The word froze the squad. It was not just vision anymore. It had a name. And names carried weight older than their rifles, older than their war. The name hung in the clearing like smoke, Fofi. The word itself felt heavier than the gunfire still echoing from the trees. The men looked to the guide, his face drained of color, his body trembling as if he had spoken a curse aloud. Captain Hale tried to steady them, his voice clipped, demanding discipline. but the spell of training was broken. Once a thing is named, it ceases to be a rumor. And this thing had been named in the very heart of the forest. The men's rifles seemed suddenly small, like sticks raised against a storm. The Jibba Fofi moved again, massive limbs tearing through branches as easily as paper. Its weight pressed down on the soil, each step quaking like distant artillery. Sergeant Grant fired first, a panicked burst that tore across the tree line. The others followed, muzzle flashes stabbing the dark in frantic rhythm. Bullets cracked against something hard, ricocheting like sparks against stone. Hale shouted for fire discipline, but no one listened. Fear had broken the chain of command. The jungle roared with gunfire, but the beast roared louder in silence, untouched. Smoke thickened, choking the clearing. White phosphorus burned where grenades had landed, casting ghostly fire across the webbing that still clung to trees. Some of the strands caught flame, curling and writhing as if alive. The guides screamed prayers, while the soldiers staggered, coughing through the haze. In the chaos, packs and rifles were dropped, equipment abandoned where men stumbled. Discipline had collapsed into survival. The squad that had entered as a unit now fractured, each man searching for escape. Panic moved faster than orders, faster than reason. Hale tried one last time to rally them, but his words were drowned by the sounds, the tearing of branches above, the thunder of limbs descending, the shriek of something massive yet unseen. Sergeant First Class Price shoved his journal into his jacket and pulled men toward the swamp's edge. "Run!" he shouted, the only command anyone obeyed. And they did. They ran through mud and smoke, weapons slipping from their hands, hearts hammering like war drums. Behind them the forest closed and the silence returned, but now it carried a name. The Jibba Fofi had been spoken, and once spoken, it would never leave them. The squad's retreat dissolved into fragments, men stumbling through mud and smoke until the jungle swallowed the chaos. By dawn, the survivors regrouped at a temporary outpost, faces hollow, uniforms torn, weapons scattered. But not all had returned. Torres was gone, consumed by the dark. 2 more names were missing, Sergeant Grant and a private whose pack was later found shredded near the swamp's edge. Captain Hale made the count in silence, his hand gripping the pencil so hard it snapped. The official tally was written in neat lines, 3 men unaccounted for. But no line could capture how they had been lost. When the report reached higher command, the language shifted. "Ambush by hostile elements" was the phrase repeated, stamped across every page. No mention of webs, no mention of silence that crushed the breath from lungs, no mention of eyes glinting in unnatural symmetry. Paper erased what the men had lived, replacing terror with bureaucracy. Orders demanded it. Nothing outside human war could be admitted. The forest could not be an enemy. The Cold War had rules, even for lies, and so 3 men vanished not into myth, but into official silence. Still, absence weighs heavier than death. Bodies left in battlefields can be buried. Names lost to the jungle remain unmoored, haunting those who survived. Sergeant First Class Price recorded the missing in his journal, though his entry was unlike the official roster. He wrote not of ranks or duties, but of voices silenced, of boots that would never march again. In the margin he scrawled one line, "Not rebels, not men. Taken." It was the only truth he allowed himself, hidden between the folds of military fiction. And for Hale, signing the report with a steady hand, the act felt less like duty and more like betrayal. The days that followed blurred into routine, but nothing about the men was the same. Faces once hardened by discipline now carried shadows, movements dulled as though their bodies marched while their minds lagged behind. Hale tried to keep order, but he could feel it. A silence thicker than command, heavier than words. Price withdrew into his notebook, pages filling with fragments of phrases, half sketches of legs that bent wrong. At night, when the lanterns burned low, some men swore they still heard the rhythm of branches snapping in orbit. Others refused to sleep at all, staring upward at the canopy, waiting for eyes that might return. Among the debris retrieved from the swamp edge, only fragments remained of those who had vanished. No flesh, no bone. But 3 insignias were recovered from the mud. Grant's chevrons, Torres's rank patch, and a cloth tab given to Moke, one of the Congolese guides who had walked with them since Stanleyville. His patch was not regulation, only a stitched strip the soldiers had made for him, a gesture to mark him as part of their line. Hale held them in his hand before locking them in a pouch, his thumb tracing the fabric as though it could tether the missing back to earth. They were entered into records as personal effects, yet none of the survivors could look at them without feeling the weight of ghosts. The trauma showed itself not in outbursts, but in silence. Men avoided campfire talk, the usual gallows humor of soldiers, replaced by long stares into the dark. When questioned, they gave answers clipped and vague, refusing to describe what they had seen. Only one diary entry slipped past the wall of silence, a line written in a cramped hand. Not gorillas. Eyes. Many eyes. They never closed. It was not confession, but survival. The kind of truth one could write only when certain no one else would read. And so the squad carried their wounds in silence, marked less by scars than by the absence of sound. When the survivors returned to base, their debrief was swift, clinical, stripped of emotion. Commanders asked about enemy positions, supply lines, rebel strength. Not one question touched on the silence of the forest, the webs across the clearing, or the creature whose name still echoed in their minds. The report was sealed as ambush by insurgents, classified for internal review. Files would carry the names of the dead, but never the truth of how they had vanished. Official history left no space for monsters. Yet among the men, truth lingered in silence. Hale avoided the word, but Price carried it in his journal, scrawled across the last page. Jibba Fofi, the forest keeps its own. Others tried to drown the memory with routine, but it clung, surfacing in the smallest things, a branch cracking underfoot, a lantern flicker, the hum of insects cutting off too soon. The jungle had marked them, and no training could erase it. They had crossed into a place where war was no longer measured in battles, but in whether a man returned at all. Some mysteries are archived, others remain alive, whispered where official records fall silent. In Congo, guides still tell of hunters who vanish under the trees, of clearings no birds cross, of webs that appear after rains, then disappear by dawn. The men who lived carried the same knowledge, though none would speak it aloud outside their circle. War had taught them to obey orders, but the forest had taught them a harsher lesson. Not every enemy carries a rifle, and not every battlefield belongs to men. History remembers battles, names of generals and lines drawn on maps. It buries what does not fit the story of men. The silence is too heavy to explain, the shadows too vast to dismiss. Somewhere in the Congo, 3 soldiers never returned, their insignias the only proof they had stood among the living. Official reports call it ambush. The survivors call it something else, though most never spoke the word aloud, Jiba Fofi. A name whispered by guides, carried by legend, and written once in a trembling hand before the page was torn away. The forest keeps its own, and some truths remain untold because they cannot be survived twice. The men who walked out of that clearing did not bring victory, nor defeat, but silence. A silence that followed them into barracks, into sleep, into years beyond the war. Some things war cannot explain, but it remembers. And somewhere, beneath the canopy where light never lingers, the name still waits. Perhaps it was myth, perhaps memory, or perhaps the forest still walks on legs no man has measured.